corporal considered slow, even by his own superiors. A destroyed Belgian city, taken over by invisible German snipers, and a deadly flaw in the Allied defenses that no one noticed, no one except him. On that frozen morning, an overlooked man saw what no officer could, and within minutes, he chose to act alone or watch his entire company fall. If this story already grabbed you, hit the like button and subscribe. It helps the channel grow a lot. Tell me in the comments, would you have the courage to act alone if you noticed something everyone else ignored? I want to know who would be the Elias of the group. The winter of 1944 pressed down on the Belgian frontier like a lid over a dying fire, trapping cold, smoke, and fear beneath it. Dawn barely existed anymore. It arrived as a pale smear behind a cloud cover, drifting weakly over a city that had already forgotten its own name. Buildings leaned at strange angles, as if they were tired of holding themselves upright. Shattered windows clung to thin veils of frost. Somewhere in the distance, metal groaned under the weight of snow and war. And through all of it, moving with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who expected nothing from anyone, walked Corporal Elias Moreau. To the officers, he was a quiet one, the distracted one, the one who always seemed a second behind the rest of the world, as if still waking from a dream. They gave him errands nobody wanted, gather torn maps, clean debris from a frozen corridor, check equipment that was barely usable. He accepted these tasks without protest, almost gratefully, because they kept him in motion. Motion meant silence. Silence meant he did not have to talk about the thing that lived inside him like a knife left in a wound. The memory of his older brother. Luc Moreau, sharp-minded, fast, admired, had settled into his heart with the weight of a stone. Luc had died 2 years earlier in a distant field Elias had never seen. And from that moment on, Elias carried both his own life and the shadow of the one he believed he had failed to protect. This morning felt colder than the others. The air scraped at his lungs, sharp as broken glass. As he knelt near a collapsed wall, collecting wind-blown scraps of paper that had once been part of a detailed defensive map, he sensed something unusual behind the fog. A low rumble, a pattern in the sound. Before he could name it, the world erupted. Shells slammed into the far side of the street, shaking the ground as if the earth itself were coughing out its last breath. Flames curled upward. The fog turned red. Elias dug behind a splintered beam, breath frozen in his throat. His mind flicked strangely between present terror and the memory of Luke teaching him how to watch for angles, how light bounced, how shadows stretched, how a sniper saw the world differently from an infantryman. Luke had explained it once with a smile, tapping a map the way a musician tapped rhythm into a desk. Elias had listened carefully. He always listened. Now, crouched between rubble, he saw the offensive unfold with frightening precision. German snipers, hidden high inside half-destroyed buildings, targeted the first Allied outpost in perfect sequence. No hesitation, no wasted shot. The post vanished under a silent, surgical strike. Elias felt the impact not only as a shock of fear, but as a jolt of understanding. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, in how their own defenses were arranged. He scanned the rooftops, the line of smoke, the scattered remnants of Allied positions. A shape formed in his mind, subtle but undeniable. The Allies' visual communication chain, normally dependable, had been laid out in a way that made it readable, predictable, to anyone with a high vantage point and patience. He pressed his back against the rubble, heart pounding, breath steaming into the cold air. He knew instantly that the enemy had mapped their habits, their angles, their routines, and no one else had seen it. Fragments of last night's observations rushed forward. He had spent hours awake, while others slept, watching how light reflected off metal sheets and broken windows. He had sketched imaginary lines in the air with his finger, testing how a sniper might interpret the silhouettes of moving soldiers. It had been a private ritual, an echo of Luke's lessons, something he did not dare mention to anyone. But now those quiet deductions became dread. He understood exactly how exposed they were. Another blast struck somewhere nearby. Snow and dust rained over him. His unit was shouting, scrambling for cover, trying to identify where the bullets came from, but Elias already knew. And for the first time in the war, He felt not confusion, not hesitation, but clarity. The enemy had cracked the pattern, and unless someone changed it, his entire company could vanish before noon. He stared through the fog, pulse steadying in the cold. He did not feel brave. He felt responsible, the way he hadn't been the day Luke died. This time, he swore silently he would not freeze. This time, he would see what others refused to see. This time, he would act. The bombardment faded into a tense, uneven silence, the kind that felt less like relief and more like the pause between the sniper's breaths. Smoke crawled to the ruined streets, clinging to the jagged outlines of collapsed houses. Elias stepped cautiously from behind the debris, boots crunching softly over frozen dust. His company was scattered across the ruins, shouting fragments of orders, none of them aware of the trap tightening around them. He felt the weight of that knowledge settling across his shoulders, heavier than his pack, heavier even than the memory of Luke. Snowflakes drifted through the haze like quiet ash. Elias watched them fall, noticing how they caught the light. Every reflection, every glint, every silver flicker made the same truth clearer. The enemy had perfect lines of sight. The patterns of their movements, their signaling, even the routes they used to rotate guards, all of it was exposed. He could almost imagine a German officer standing at some vantage point with a notebook, sketching the Allied habits with practiced precision. He spotted Lieutenant Harlan near a half-collapsed wall, barking orders into the wind. Elias approached, forcing his legs to move even though dread pressed against his ribs. "Sir," he began, voice tight, "the snipers aren't firing at random. They're reading our visual lines. The reflective points on the street, metal shards, broken windows. They're giving away where our sentries move. If we shift some of the debris, we might—" Harlan cut him off with a sharp look, as if swatting away a fly. "Morrow, this isn't the time for theories. Return to your post." "But, sir—" "Now!" It was not anger that burned in Elias's chest. It was the old, familiar hollow ache of being dismissed, of seeing something others refused to see, of remembering Luke's voice telling him to trust his eyes, even when others didn't. He stepped back, heart thudding in frustration. Around him, soldiers scrambled under worsening fire. Another Allied lookout fell. Another flash from a distant window signaled an enemy shot. They were running out of time. Elias retreated behind a fractured stone archway, pulse racing as he scanned the street. His mind, usually hesitant, moved quickly now, shuffling angles, mapping shadows, replaying each sniper flash. He could trace the triangulation in his head. He could see exactly where the Germans expected movement, exactly where they had drawn invisible lines to anticipate Allied reactions. And then, amid the chaos and cold, something within him stilled. He didn't need permission. He didn't need recognition. He just needed to buy a few minutes of confusion, enough for the company to survive. He crouched low, breath fogging before him, and made his decision with the quiet certainty of someone sliding a final piece into a puzzle. He would change the pattern himself. He would break the enemy's map, even if no one ever knew. Elias moved through the rubble like a shadow learning to breathe. The cold pressed hard into his joints, but adrenaline dulled the sting. He kept low, slipping between broken door frames and splintered beams, following an internal map formed not from orders, but from instinct, angles, reflections, sight lines. The things he had studied in silence. The things no one valued until now, when they might be the only path out of disaster. He reached the edge of a ruined square, where a burned-out truck lay on its side. Its metal frame caught the pale light of morning, sending weak reflections across the street. To an untrained eye, it meant nothing. To a sniper, it was a signpost. Elias crouched beside it, fingers brushing the frozen dust as he traced the arcs of reflected light with his gaze. The Germans would be watching these glints, these predictable flashes, expecting Allied silhouettes to cross at familiar points. He had to disrupt everything. Footsteps crunched nearby. Sergeant Duval sprinted past with two riflemen, ducking behind a collapsed shop front as a sniper shot sliced overhead. Elias felt the impact of the bullet echo through the stone like a cold heartbeat. The sergeant didn't notice him. No one ever really noticed Elias unless they needed something carried or cleaned. That anonymity, once a quiet humiliation, now became a shield. If they didn't look at him, They wouldn't question where he went. He scanned the upper floors of the surrounding ruins. Shadows wavered behind shattered windows. There, 3 positions at least, maybe more, high, concealed, with perfect command of the square. They expected the Allies to cling to routine, to run the same routes, to move predictably under pressure. Elias inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He would give them a show, a false one. He crawled to the truck's undercarriage and extracted a sheet of twisted metal barely the size of a helmet. It felt icy against his palms. A few meters away, a broken street sign lay half buried in the snow. He dragged it quietly toward the wall of a gutted cafe. Every movement required patience. Every scrape risked a shot. But the snipers held fire, still waiting for the patterns they trusted. Good. He angled the first piece of metal near a doorway, so that it would catch and redirect the fading daylight across the snow in a moving band, something that mimicked the subtle shift of a soldier passing through. Then he placed a street sign behind a collapsed pillar where it would tilt in the wind, casting a brief flicker like a man adjusting his stance. One illusion wasn't enough. He needed several, spaced irregularly, so they would look like motion from a hasty, confused patrol. Elias crept to a broken vehicle chassis, propped a loose engine plate against a beam, and watched as it bounced a thin stripe of light onto a second-floor window. A sniper might assume a lookout had climbed to a new perch. Shots cracked instantly, 2, then 3, toward the reflections. Elias flinched but did not move. The deception was working. The enemy was guessing, recalibrating, firing at phantoms instead of men. A surge of hope swelled inside him. Not pride. Elias didn't know the shape of pride anymore, but purpose. He was disrupting the enemy's rhythm. He was breaking the invisible net tightening around his unit. Behind him, he heard Allied boots crunch through snow, followed by hurried whispers. A squad was preparing to push forward, believing the sniper's sudden misfires meant a mistake on the German side. They didn't know that Elias had tilted the field beneath everyone's feet. They didn't know they were moving inside a moment he had carved out for them. He wiped frost from his brow and pressed deeper into ruins. The illusions needed to grow, needed to spread, needed to look alive. For the first time since the war began, Elias felt he was exactly where he was meant to be. Elias slipped deeper into the ruins. Each movement measured, controlled, almost ritualistic. The city seemed to breathe around him in long, aching sighs. Wind moving through shattered hallways, loose metal tapping softly against stone, distant artillery grumbling like a storm beyond the hills. He kept his body low and his senses wide open, listening not just for danger but for opportunity. Every corridor, every toppled beam, every shard of glass was a tool waiting to be used. A thin curtain of fog drifted between 2 collapsed apartment blocks. Elias crossed under it, boots sinking slightly into wet ash. Here, the reflections were different, scattered by puddles, broken by piles of debris. The snipers would expect minimal movement on this side of the district. Most Allied troops avoided it because the terrain forced them into choke points, which meant this was the perfect place to build a second layer of illusions. He found a bent rail segment lying near a burned doorway. The metal caught the weak afternoon light in a wide arc. If positioned correctly, it could mimic the glint of a rifle barrel shifting in someone's hands. He carried it to an exposed corner, braced it with a brick, and waited. A faint beam flickered across a nearby window frame, trembling like a nervous lookout silhouette. Perfect. A single German shot rang out moments later, striking the stone above the glimmer. Elias felt the vibration through his knees. If the sniper had known how close Elias was, he would have fired again. But the illusion held. It bought him seconds. And seconds were everything. He moved on, dragging another sheet of metal behind a collapsed staircase. Its edge scraped lightly across the ground, producing a pattern of sound that could suggest shifting equipment or patrol regrouping. He angled the sheet against a broken radiator, forming a crude reflector. As the wind nudged it, the light quivered in erratic bursts, enough to convince anyone watching that troops were circling around from the left flank. More shots followed, panicked ones, uncertain ones. The enemy had lost their clean rhythm. Elias could feel it. A shout echoed from the other side of the ruins, a familiar voice. Sergeant Duval again, leading a small team forward, emboldened by the sudden chaos among the snipers. They rushed through the square Elias had manipulated earlier, unaware of the phantom signals guiding their path. Elias allowed himself a small, tight breath of relief. Every step they took, without being hit, told him his plan was holding. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. He reached a narrow alleyway where an overturned boiler lay in pieces. A large curved panel caught his attention. If he could angle it toward the higher buildings, he might simulate the glint of binoculars, the telltale sign of an Allied spotter, that would draw fire upward, away from the advancing squads. He lifted the panel with both hands. It was heavier than he expected, and propped it against a broken pipe. He adjusted the angle inch by inch until the reflection reached the height he wanted. The moment it caught the light, a sniper shot shattered a brick above it. Another followed, then a third. Elias ducked behind the boiler fragments, heart pounding but steady. The trap was holding. The snipers were wasting ammunition, striking at ghosts. From his hiding place, he watched Duval's assault team slip through a vulnerable corridor now left unguarded by enemy fire. They were moving toward the central building, the key position that had pinned the Allies for hours. If they reached it, the entire front line could shift. Elias pressed his gloved hand against the cold ground and listened to the echoes of gunfire twisting across the ruins. His illusions were splintered things, simple, fragile tricks, but together they had reshaped the battlefield. He wondered, fleetingly, what Luke would think if he could see this, if he would recognize, in these makeshift signals and quiet manipulations, some distant reflection of his own lessons. The thought tightened Elias's throat, but there was no time for sentiment. Not when the next few minutes would decide who lived and who didn't. The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant crackle of small arms fire in the low, rolling thunder of artillery far beyond the ridge. Elias felt the change immediately. The temperature dropped, the air sharpening into something brittle. Something that warned him the day was sliding toward late afternoon. Shadows lengthened across the ruined streets, stretching into long, distorted shapes that crawled between the rubble. This was both a gift and a threat. Shadows could hide him, but they could also hide the enemy. He crouched behind a fractured stone fountain, catching his breath. His gloves were stiff with frozen dust, and each inhale burned deep in his chest. Still, his mind moved quickly, assessing how the new lighting could work for him. As the sun lowered, reflections grew weaker but more directional. That meant he could control them with even greater precision if he found the right pieces of debris. A burst of gunfire from a main street snapped him back into motion. He peeked over the fountain's rim. Duval's team had reached the steps of the central building, the one anchoring the German line, but they were pinned down by a fresh wave of sniper fire. Elias had disrupted the enemy's rhythm, but the snipers were adapting. They were probing, searching for the real threat. He needed a bolder move. Across the square, half buried in snow, he spotted a rusted metal door blown from its hinges. It was wide, heavy, and concave, perfect for catching the fading sunlight and projecting it upward like a signal flare. If he could angle it toward the top floors where the snipers hid, he might be able to blind them for a few seconds. A few seconds could be everything. He sprinted for it, keeping low, legs pumping through patches of loose ice. A shot cracked behind him. Stone fragments exploded near his shoulder. Another shot followed, closer. The snipers had noticed movement, even if they couldn't identify him. Elias dug behind the metal door, breath trembling, heart hammering so loudly he feared the enemy might hear it. He gripped the door's edge and pulled. It resisted at first, half frozen into the ground. With a grunt, he wrenched it free. The metal screeched softly across the snow. Each sound felt painfully loud. He shifted to one knee, angled the door using a broken beam as support, and waited for the sun to hit it. When it did, the reflection flared sharply, brighter than any he had created before, a sudden burst that shot upward like a blade of light. A sniper fired instinctively, the shot veering wildly. Another tried to adjust. Elias tilted the door again, sending the beam across a second building. More panicked shots followed. It worked. They were blinded, even if only momentarily. Duval's team surged forward, seizing the opportunity. Grenades arced into windows. Rifle fire echoed through the square. The central building, so long an immovable threat, shuddered with the force of the assault. Elias knew the tide was turning. He could feel it in the sudden shift of the battlefield's rhythm, in the way the gunfire no longer sounded like inevitability, but possibility. He pressed his back against the metal door, letting his breath steady. The square around him remained deadly. Snipers still lurked, and the enemy had not fully collapsed. But the balance had changed, and he had done it without firing a single shot. The old ache inside him stirred again. Luke had once told him that war wasn't always won by strength or speed. Sometimes it was won by seeing what others missed. He wondered briefly if this was what his brother had meant. This strange, lonely clarity in the middle of chaos. But there was no time to dwell on it. The enemy was regrouping, and Elias still had more to do. The gunfire ebbed for a moment, replaced by the eerie quiet that often followed sudden shifts on the battlefield. Elias knew better than to trust it. Silence in war was not peace, only the breath drawn before the next strike. He crouched behind the metal door, watching wisps of smoke drift lazily between broken walls. Duval's team was now inside the central building, their silhouettes moving cautiously behind shattered windows. If they secured it, the entire German chokehold on the district would collapse. But the snipers, though shaken, were not finished. Elias scanned the rooftops again. The enemy shooters were repositioning. Their shots were no longer wild or panicked. They had recognized the illusions. Not entirely. He doubted they understood what he had done, but they sensed deception. Their fire patterns grew measured, probing, disciplined. They were searching for the true source of the disruption. He pulled back into the alley, heart thudding with a new urgency. His tricks wouldn't last much longer. The snipers were too experienced, too methodical. To buy more time, he needed to expand the illusion beyond simple reflections. He needed movement, apparent movement. A collapsed balcony lay nearby, its metal rails bent and twisted. Elias examined them, then spotted a length of torn canvas tangled around a beam. If he combined them, rails angled upright, canvas stretched loosely, they could mimic the shape of a soldier crouching or shifting behind cover. In this failing light, even a silhouette could draw fire. He worked quickly, using debris as tools. A piece of pipe became a brace. A broken crate gave him enough leverage to lift the heaviest beam. He tied the canvas to the rails with shaking hands, feeling the cold bite into his fingers even through his gloves. When he stepped back, the silhouette looked disturbingly real, just vague enough to be mistaken under pressure, just solid enough to threaten. He shoved the structure toward a gap in the wall, where shadows gathered thickly. The moment it settled into place, sunlight stretched its form across the opposite building. A sniper fired within seconds. Then another, then two more. Elias ducked, forcing his body against the ground as dust burst overhead. The enemy had taken the bait. They were firing at a ghost shape, and while they concentrated on that false target, Duval's team advanced deeper into the building. But the deception illuminated a new danger. The shots came from three distinct positions, farther apart than he had estimated. There were more snipers than he had realized. And worse, one of them, positioned high in a skeletal tower, hadn't fired at the decoy at all. That one was watching, studying, waiting. A cold tension tightened around Elias's spine. That sniper was a real threat, the one reading the battlefield the way Elias did, the one who might anticipate his next move. He slid back behind the rubble, breath quickening. He needed to neutralize that vantage point. Not directly, not with weapons, but by overwhelming it with confusion. If he could fill the sniper's field of vision with enough conflicting signals, even a disciplined marksman would need precious seconds to interpret the scene. Seconds that Duval's team, and the rest of the company, desperately needed. He searched the ruins again, desperate for anything reflective, anything that could produce layered illusions. His gaze landed on a shattered mirrored arm while lying half-buried under bricks. Most of the glass was broken, but several pieces still clung to the frame at crooked angles. Perfect. He crawled toward it, ignoring the sting in his knees, and pried loose one triangular shard. Then another. He arranged them against a broken pipe, forming a crude cluster of angled surfaces. If the light hit them right, they would send unpredictable flashes across multiple rooftops. A distant explosion rumbled, shaking dust into the air. The sun dipped lower. Time was running out. Elias angled the mirrors, adjusted them, waited, corrected again. Finally, thin streaks of light flickered upward, subtle, rapid, disorienting. In the tower, the watching sniper hesitated. That hesitation was everything. Duval's squad burst into the upper floors of the central building. Elias exhaled shakily. His illusions were fraying, their effectiveness shrinking by the second. But they were still holding, still bending the battle in favor of his men. He pressed a hand against the cold ground and stared toward the tower. He wasn't sure how many more tricks he had left, but he wasn't done yet. Not as long as his company was still in danger. The fading daylight bled into a dull copper haze, the kind that made the ruins look older than they were, ancient, abandoned, as if the war had already erased every trace of life. Elias moved through this dying light with the careful precision of someone who knew he was nearing the limit of what instinct alone could achieve. His illusions had pushed the enemy off balance, but the snipers were recalibrating, their shots tightening into controlled bursts again. The ghost signals were losing their power. He crouched near the mirrored shards, adjusting their angles one more time, but the sun had sunk too low. The beams were thin now, weak, easily missed. They flickered across the rooftops like the last breaths of a candle. The tower sniper, the watcher, had stopped reacting entirely. The man was waiting for Elias to slip, to show his real position. And Elias felt the crosshairs somewhere in the air, unseen but unmistakably present. A crack echoed from the central building. A German machine gun opened fire from a rear annex Elias hadn't realized was still manned. Duval's squad was caught mid-movement, pinned behind a load-bearing column now crumbling under sustained fire. The assault, so close to succeeding, threatened to collapse entirely. If the team failed, the snipers would recover full control, and the company would be trapped again. Everything Elias had done would evaporate like smoke. He felt fear curl coldly around his ribs. But underneath it, something steadier took shape. A clarity he hadn't felt since the first blast that morning. He knew exactly what to do. Nearby, a section of the street had collapsed into a shallow crater filled with broken crates, ammunition belts, and fragments of roofing. Among the debris lay a large, charred metal sign, some old shopfront plate, warped but intact, heavy enough to shield him from a few glancing shots, large enough to cast a massive reflection if he dared to stand with it. Dared. That was the word echoing in his skull. He gripped the sign, muscles straining. It was ungainly, awkward, twice his width, but as he lifted it, he felt a strange surge of calm settle over him. Luke had faced danger like this, calculated, deliberate, with a quiet understanding that hesitation killed faster than bullets. Elias wasn't Luke, but maybe he didn't need to be. Maybe being himself, seeing what others didn't, was finally enough. He took a slow breath, rose from behind the rubble, and stepped into the open. The tower sniper fired instantly. The shot slammed into the metal plate, ringing like a church bell across the square. Elias staggered, boots sliding in the slush. But he held the plate steady, turning it, angling it, forcing every remaining glint of sunlight to flare outward in sharp, chaotic bursts. Dozens of flashes cut through the haze. Erratic, blinding, impossible to track. More sniper fire erupted. 2 shots, then 3, all hammering against the plate, driving Elias backward. The force rattled his arms, numbed his fingers. But he kept moving, rotating the sign in patterns the enemy could not predict. Light danced wildly across the ruined facades. For a moment, the snipers couldn't tell where he stood, where the real threat was, or even how many men were in the open. The tower sniper finally faltered. Duval's team seized a moment. Through the upper windows, Elias saw silhouettes rushing forward, grenades arcing into the annex. A burst of flame lit the interior. The machine gun fell silent. German defenders scrambled for cover, but too late. The assault team pushed through them with sudden, brutal momentum. Elias felt the shift immediately. The battlefield changed its pulse. The German line broke. For the first time all day, the Allied position held the advantage, but the cost hit him in the same instant. The plate cracked under the next impact. A sniper round punched clean through a weak point near the edge. Splinters of metal shot past his arm. Elias stumbled, falling to one knee. The sign slipped from his grasp with a heavy clang. A final sniper shot tore into the stone beside him, showering him with dust. Then silence, real silence, the kind that came only when the enemy line collapsed. Elias lowered his head, breath quivering in the cold air. His arms trembled from strain. His ears rang from the impacts. But he was alive, and his company was alive because he had stepped into the open when no one else could. He pulled himself back behind the debris, chest tight, vision swimming. But steady. It was almost over. Almost. Night crept slowly over the ruined city, settling into every crack and crater like a dark, exhausted blanket. The last gunshots faded into distant echoes. The fog thickened again, turning the broken streets into quiet corridors of drifting gray. Elias stayed crouched behind the debris for several long breaths, listening for any hint that the enemy might regroup. But there was nothing. Only the low murmur of allied voices moving cautiously through recently reclaimed ground. He pushed himself upright. His legs shook, not from fear but from the hours of tension finally unwinding. The metal plate that shielded him lay split in two, a jagged reminder of how thin survival could be. Elias stared at it for a moment, feeling an odd mix of relief and disbelief. He hadn't meant to become the center of anything. He had wanted only to stop the bleeding, to prevent another name from being carved onto a wooden cross the way Luke's had been. Yet the battlefield now bore the imprint of everything he had done. Shards repositioned, beams angled, debris arranged with invisible intent. It looked like chaos to anyone else. But to Elias, it was a map of choices, each one drawn with steady hands and quiet resolve. Bootsteps approached. Duval emerged from the gloom, face streaked with soot, helmet dented, breath fogging sharply in the cold. He looked at Elias as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "Moreau," he muttered, voice rough. "We don't know what happened out here, but whatever was gave us that building." Elias opened his mouth, but found no words. Duval didn't press him. Soldiers rarely demanded explanations when they were busy counting the living. The sergeant gave him a short nod, half gratitude, half exhaustion, then moved on to help secure the perimeter. Other men passed as well. They walked through the areas Elias had reshaped, glancing at shattered windows and strange reflections without understanding the hidden logic behind them. None of them asked how the snipers had lost their precision. None questioned why the enemy had wasted so much ammunition on empty corners and phantom silhouettes. In the confusion of victory, small miracles were accepted without analysis. And that was enough. Elias gathered what remained of his strength and began walking. His boots pressed shallow prints into the snow-covered street as he crossed a square that had almost killed him. He walked with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone emerging from a long storm. The air smelled of dust, burnt metal, and the faint sweetness of frost. The sky above was a dull, starless gray. But the city felt different now. Less like a tomb, more like a wounded creature taking its first uncertain breath after a brutal blow. As he passed a half-collapsed wall, a faint glimmer caught his eye. One of the angled metal sheets he had placed earlier reflected a sliver of moonlight. A second reflection flickered across a broken window. Another shimmered on a puddle near the curb. They formed three pale shadows that stretched across the street and merged with his own, long and wavering. For a moment, Elias stopped walking. The reflections shifted with him, silent companions made from broken fragments. They reminded him of Luke, not in shape or form, but in presence, in the quiet echo of lessons remembered, in the strange, bittersweet thought that maybe in all these improvised illusions, he had finally done something his brother would have understood. He lowered his gaze, letting the feelings settle in his chest. A mix of grief and peace, heavy but warm. No medals would come. No reports would mention his name. Command would bury the irregularities, erase the improvisations, maintain the clean fiction of standard procedure. He would return to carrying crates and cleaning tools, moving to the camp the same quiet way he always had. But tonight, dozens of men were alive who would not have been. And Elias knew. He walked on, disappearing slowly into the dimming fog, his silhouette multiplying in every broken surface he passed. 3 shadows. 4. 5. Each one a silent echo of the courage no one saw, but everyone depended on. A small, invisible legacy drawn in light, angles, and the stubborn will of a man who refused to let history repeat its cruelty.